The hoe struck something hard, deep beneath the damp earth, near the magnolia tree in my parents' backyard. The sound wasn't of stone. It was dry, muffled, almost metallic. My heart raced. There was something there, buried long ago. My husband, Daniel, was beside me. When he saw what it was, he fell to his knees, pale, speechless. The lid of the box was covered in thin roots and dark moss. Daniel said nothing, just trembled. His hands, once steady, now wavered in the air as if trying to touch, but unable to. "Did you know that?" he whispered, almost voiceless. I nodded, but I already felt that this moment would change everything. I had grown up in that backyard. I had played around that tree 1,000 times, but I never imagined it hid a secret capable of destroying someone. The box was made of ancient wood, locked with a rusty padlock. Daniel recognized it before we even opened it. "It's my father's," he said, his voice breaking. It didn't make sense. How had a box belonging to Daniel's father ended up in my parents' backyard? The man had died 20 years earlier, and according to family history, he had disappeared without a trace. Now, suddenly, the past was there, literally buried among the roots of a tree that had grown over it. The silence that followed was brutal. The box seemed to radiate a truth no one was ready to face. Daniel stepped away, sat on the floor, and covered his face. I felt a weight on my chest, as if the earth had been stirred inside me too. Something terrible was about to emerge, and there was no stopping it. Before continuing, share this story to reach further, subscribe to the channel, share this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment where you're listening from. I read each comment with affection, and knowing that you're here with me on this journey makes it all worth it. I called my mother, who was in the kitchen. She came into the backyard, wiping her hands on her apron, but froze when she saw the box. Her face drained of color as if she'd seen a ghost. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice unfamiliar. Daniel stood up, looked her in the eye, and repeated, "Why is this here?" My mother hesitated. She touched the wood as if touching an open wound. Her lips trembled before finally saying, "This should have stayed buried." Daniel took a step back. I'd never seen him like that. It wasn't anger. It was pure panic. A fear that seemed to come from a forgotten place, deep, hidden for decades. I wanted to understand, but I felt it wasn't the time to press. We picked up the box and carried it inside, silently. My mother locked the door. My father was in the living room. When he saw what we were carrying, he stood up slowly, as if his bones knew exactly what was about to happen. And maybe they did. The three of us sat at the kitchen table, the box between us like a corpse awaiting autopsy. My father whispered, "Are you sure you want to open this?" Daniel answered with his eyes, "Yes." So, without further ado, we grabbed a pair of pliers, broke the lock, and removed the lid. The smell that came from inside was old, dense, heavy. Inside were letters, photographs, a necklace, and a will, all in Daniel's father's name, all dated before he disappeared. And in the first letter, one name repeated over and over, my mother's. That was how it all began. A buried past, a secret intertwined with two families, and an abyss about to open. My name is Emily. I grew up in that simple house, with reddish bricks and a large yard, surrounded by trees and heavy silences. My parents were always reserved, but never cold. On the contrary, my mother was the type who paid attention to details, who cooked excessively, who did everything to keep up appearances. Daniel came into my life when I was 22. He was different, quiet, intense, always carrying an air of melancholy that I never fully understood. He said his father disappeared when he was just 8. One night, he left home and never returned. No one knew why. No one investigated thoroughly. Over the years, I noticed Daniel avoided talking about it. Every time I asked, he deflected. "Nothing changes now," he always said. His mother had died shortly after his disappearance, and he grew up with his grandparents. He was a man marked by abandonment, and I learned to respect his silence. But now, everything made more sense. His pain, the gaps in his story, his troubled dreams at night. That box buried in my backyard was directly linked to his broken childhood, and somehow, my parents, especially my mother, had known this for a long time. The fear in her eyes said it all. I sat with Daniel in our room that night. He couldn't stop rereading the letter. His hands were shaking. It was as if each word reopened an old wound. "Why is your mother involved in this?" he asked, without looking at me. I didn't know how to answer. I didn't know either. It devastated me. It made me doubt everything. At that moment, a memory hit me. I must have been about 10 years old when I saw my mother burning a similar box, hidden behind the house. At the time, I thought it was just old trash, but now I understand. She didn't want any of this to come to light, and for some reason, the past decided to resurface, of all times now. The next day, Daniel woke up before me. When I got up, he was already in the car, searching for answers. He took the box with him. He sent a short message. "I'm going to the police files. I need to understand what no one has ever wanted to tell." My stomach churned. I felt like something huge was about to collapse. I stayed home with my mother. The atmosphere was unbreathable. I tried to act normal, but she could tell. Then, suddenly, she dropped the dishes in the sink, sat at the table, and said, "You need to listen to me without interrupting." Her voice was firm, but her face looked like someone who had been carrying a burden for decades. She said she met Daniel's father before she even met my father, that they were involved, lived an intense, secret love, but he was married. And when she found out she was pregnant, he promised to leave everything, but he never had the time. He disappeared a week later. No one has ever found his body. To this day, my world fell apart. You had a child with him?" I asked. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "But I lost it. It was risky. I never told anyone." My heart pounded like a drum. So this man wasn't just Daniel's father. He was also the man who could have been my biological father. The line between our families was broken and too intertwined. When I told Daniel this over the phone, he didn't respond for a few seconds. Then, in a hushed voice, he said, "So my entire life has been built on lies, and yours too." He hung up, and I knew he was in much deeper than either of us had imagined. And maybe it was already too late to turn back. It was at that moment that I understood what that box meant. It wasn't just a secret. It was the origin of everything that went wrong. And now that it was unearthed, no one would emerge unscathed. Not him, not me, not my parents. It was the beginning of the end, or perhaps the beginning of a new truth, and every truth exacts a price. That night, Daniel didn't come home. His phone went straight to voicemail. I tried not to freak out, but my mind was already imagining the worst. The pain I saw in his eyes was too deep to bear alone. I grabbed my keys, got in my car, and drove aimlessly, praying I'd find him somewhere, anywhere. I went to the town cemetery. It was strange, but something guided me there. And there, in the far corner, he was, sitting on the ground, holding one of the letters from the box. He wasn't crying. He just stared into space, as if time had stopped. I sat beside him without saying a word. Just being there was a decision. After several long minutes, he spoke. I found out where he was buried. Not officially, but according to an anonymous tip made 20 years ago, he was left here, under a false name. Chills ran down my spine. "And do you know who made the tip?" he continued. "Your father, using a name he used in the 90s. My world turned upside down. My father? Involved in covering up his father's death? It was too crazy to be a coincidence. Daniel looked at me for the first time that night. "I need to know what your father hid. And you, are you ready to find out too?" I took a deep breath. Yes, I'm ready. It was now or never. We returned home and found my father on the porch, as if he'd already known he was about to be questioned. Daniel said bluntly, "You knew my father, didn't you?" My father hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, and I know exactly where he was buried." The sentence cut through the air like a blade. No one moved. No one blinked. He didn't try to justify himself. He just said, "If you want to know everything, I'll show you tomorrow morning." That night, no one slept. The entire past was about to emerge, and we were facing the kind of truth that is unforgettable, and that changes everything. The decision had already been made, and now, there was no turning back. The next morning, before sunrise, we were all in the car, Daniel, my mother, my father, and I. The silence between us was thick, full of the unspoken past. We arrived at an abandoned lot behind an old church. Tall grass covered everything. My father got out with slow steps, as if each memory weighed on his legs. He pointed to a secluded corner. "It was there," he said. Daniel walked to the exact spot and knelt. He began digging with his hands. Minutes later, the dry sound of ancient wood, a small coffin, buried without ceremony, without a headstone. Daniel fell to the ground, exhausted. My father looked away, as if he didn't want to see his own past. "He threatened your mother," my father said. "She asked me for help, and I did what I could. My mother covered her mouth with her hands. Daniel turned to her, eyes wide. Did he abuse you? She nodded silently, but no one ever said anything. I just knew he disappeared. I was a child. Daniel's voice broke the air. The tension between them exploded. Daniel backed away, pacing in circles. So you buried the father who abandoned me because he was a monster? My father replied with an old pain. Yes, but also because no one would have believed us back then. And because your mother was afraid, really afraid. The story spread. The police were called, even after so many years. Local newspapers reported the discovery of the body. Neighbors began to speculate and judge. Mrs. Helen's husband killed a man, they said. But no one knew what happened inside that house in the 1990s, and they may never know completely. Daniel had to relive the abandonment, but now with new meaning. The father he silently idolized wasn't a hero. He was a violent, cruel man. And the one who hid it wasn't a murderer. It was someone trying to protect him. The pain was different now, and the truth was still hard to accept, but he couldn't run from it anymore. At the police station, Daniel told everything. He handed over the letters, the will, the documents from the box. At first, the police were skeptical. After all, the case was over 20 years old, but the details matched old records. My father's anonymous tip was now key. The case was reopened as a concealment of a body. My father didn't run away. He sat down with investigators and told his story. He said Daniel's father had been threatening my mother for months. That one night he showed up drunk, breaking everything. That he reacted to protect himself, a blow with an iron tool. There was no plan. There was instinct, panic, then silence. My mother confirmed everything. She said she lived in fear of telling, but that she never got over what happened. I buried my past in that backyard, she said. But justice doesn't work based on emotional pain. And even though she had protected him, my father would now face prosecution. Daniel listened in silence, expressionless. That night, he came to me and said, I don't know what to feel. Part of me hates all of this. Part of me understands. But none of this brings my father back. And now, I don't even know if I wanted it to. It was the first time he spoke of his father without idealizing it. As if suddenly the myth had become a man, and men also make mistakes. The tree covering the box was cut down days later. The city claimed structural risk, but I knew. It was symbolic. That tree was what hid, what smothered. Now everything was exposed. Daniel stood there, staring at the trunk lying on the ground. What comes from a secret like that? He asked, and I didn't know how to answer. But even without an answer, we knew something new had begun. It wasn't light, nor was it pretty, but it was real. For the first time, all the pieces were on the table, and that, as painful as it was liberating, because there is no healing without confrontation, and there is no healing without truth. The months that followed were a time of new beginnings. My father awaited trial, but his lawyer claimed self-defense. Daniel began visiting my mother frequently. Curiously, they formed an unexpected bond. The pain that united them also brought them closer. It was confusing, but also beautiful in a strange way. Our dinners were silent at first, each of us dealing with our own ruins, but gradually, conversations returned. We talked about music, childhood, and longing. Daniel told me things about his mother he'd never told me before. I discovered he still kept letters from her, and that he'd been writing in a hidden notebook since he was 15. One day, he showed me the notebook. Pages and pages of memories, anger, confusion, longing. This was the place where I kept everything no one wanted to hear, he said. We read it together. We cried together. Because there, between the lines, was the boy who had been left behind, ignored, silenced. And now, he was being heard. That's when he had the idea, to turn it into a book. Not as revenge, but as healing. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that silence kills more than violence. He started writing and I helped. I revised, edited, supported. It was our project, our way of taking a rotten past and planting something new. The book began to attract attention even before it was published. Editors, journalists, psychologists, everyone wanted to know the real story behind the buried box. But Daniel always said, it's not about the crime. It's about the silence. It's about everything we swallow because we think no one will believe it. And that resonated deeply with many people. There, amidst the chaos, the wait for justice, the uncertainty, there was creation, there was love, there was reconstruction. And although it was still difficult to sleep some nights, there was a certainty we'd never had before. Everything that is born of truth can flourish, even in the most wounded soil. The book launch was a modest event, but it had a huge impact. Daniel gave a local interview, and the next day, the video went viral. People who had experienced similar stories began sending messages. Children from broken families, women who hid abuse, children who buried secrets along with their childhood. The national press followed suit, but Daniel declined most interviews. I don't want them to become a spectacle of trauma. I want it to become a space for listening. The publisher understood. The book came out with the title, Under the Magnolia, and on the cover, a simple illustration of a half-open box beneath the roots. It was poetic and powerful. Sales exploded. Not because of marketing, but because the story was real, raw, and urgent. Schools began using excerpts in lectures on domestic violence and mental health. Therapists cited the chapters in sessions. Daniel, previously so quiet, was now heard by thousands, and for the first time, he felt worthy of being heard. The repercussions also reached the justice system. My father's case began to receive more attention. Public pressure divided opinions. Some saw him as a murderer, others as a tragic hero. But most importantly, no one could now pretend they didn't know. The truth was everywhere, in the newspapers, on social media, in street conversations. At home, the routine changed. There was more care, more respectful silence. My father, still awaiting the court's decision, read the book in fragments. Sometimes he wept silently. Sometimes he closed his eyes and simply said, "I'm sorry, son." Daniel never responded with words, but he remained in the room. And sometimes, that alone was answer enough. The old tree was replaced by a garden. Daniel chose to plant lavender. "To lighten the air," he said. Each flower seemed a reminder that something new could be born from what was buried. And even without forgetting, even with scars, there was now a potential ground, a home under reconstruction. I started keeping my own diary. Reading Daniel's inspired me. I wrote about my childhood, about my mother, about the day I saw her burn that box behind the house. For the first time, I understood that I, too, was shaped by silence, that not speaking was the rule I learned early on. But now, finally, I could break it. Daniel supported me, but he also lived through his own process. Sometimes we lay in silence, just breathing. Sometimes he woke from nightmares, reliving his father's face, the letters, the hidden burial. And that was okay. The pain didn't need to be healed all at once. It just needed to be acknowledged and respected. That's what they never did to him. My mother changed. She no longer justified herself. She didn't try to erase the facts. She just stayed. She sat at the table. She participated in the readings. Sometimes she laughed. Sometimes she cried. But she was there. And that, after so many years of running away, was already a huge step. She said, if I had spoken up sooner, maybe none of this would have happened. But there was no longer room for guilt. There was room for a new beginning. One day, Daniel said to her, "You saved me, not from my father, but from silence." And she cried like a child. They hugged for long minutes, and in that hug, there was forgiveness, not the kind that erases everything, but the kind that accepts that something can be rebuilt, even after it's fallen apart. We became, unexpectedly, a family, not the traditional kind, but the possible kind, stitched together by pain, glued together by the courage to say, this happened, this hurt, but this won't define me. We started cooking together, planning little trips, laughing, and that laughter was different. It was honest, weightless. Today, we understand that the bonds that sustain a family aren't made of blood alone, nor of a beautiful story. They're made of truth, of presence, of courage. And if ours began with a buried box, now it blossoms with every word that was never spoken before. And that is miracle enough to keep it going. My father's trial took place on a cold, late afternoon. The courtroom was packed, reporters outside, cameras trying to capture every detail. Daniel went. He sat in the second row, eyes fixed on the man he had once hated, and now, painfully understood. I stood beside him, hands clasped. The silence was heavy. The prosecutor spoke firmly. He described the crime, highlighted the lack of an official complaint, and questioned why the body was hidden. But the defense attorney was decisive. He presented evidence of the history of abuse, the letters, my mother's account. He said it wasn't murder, It was desperation. It was protection. It was a mistake, born of fear. My mother was called to testify. She was trembling, but she spoke clearly. She said she never wanted it to end like this, but that at that time, no one would believe her. Society, neighbors, even the police. Everyone normalized the screams. If he had killed me, maybe someone would just say it was jealousy. The entire room went silent. Daniel was the last to speak. He took the stand with a choked voice. He said he lost his father twice, when he disappeared, and when he discovered who he really was. But I also gained a new perspective on those who remained, and I understood that a woman's silence isn't cowardice, it's survival. The judge wiped away a tear. Everyone listened without blinking. At the end of the day, the sentence was handed down. Reduced sentence, semi-open prison, recognition of self-defense. My father cried as he left the room. He hugged Daniel. They didn't apologize. They just hugged for a long time. It was then that I realized, justice isn't just jail or acquittal. Sometimes justice is having your story finally recognized. The sun was setting as we left the courthouse. Daniel looked at me and said, "Hatred didn't win, truth won." And with that sentence, we closed a chapter. Not perfect, but complete. And it all began there, in the backyard, with a tree, a box, and the courage to dig to the bottom, even without knowing what we would find. Months later, the book was translated into other languages. Universities included excerpts and debates on intergenerational violence. Daniel began giving lectures. No pretense, just the truth. He always began by saying, "I didn't come here to tell a pretty story. I came to tell a story no one wanted to hear." The lavender in our garden grew. Every morning Daniel watered it carefully, sometimes in silence, sometimes listening to old songs. It was his peaceful ritual. The ancient tree gave way to this garden of memories. Not to forget, but to remember with ease. Because even wounded soil can flourish, if well cared for. My father, now on probation, became a quieter man. Retired, he began making wooden sculptures. One of them was a small box, just like the one in the backyard, but this one had a glass lid, and inside, a piece of paper with a phrase he wrote himself, "Truth, when buried, never stops growing." Daniel cried when he read it, not because it still hurt, but because now he could cry without hiding, because now he was heard. The wound was there, but it was part of the landscape, no longer an endless hole. And that, for someone who lived buried in silence, is the greatest victory possible. I also wrote an article. I published it in a women's magazine. The title was, "The Day I Digged the Earth and Found My Husband's Past." I received messages from women all over the country, women who had buried abuse, stories, fears, women who understood that sometimes digging hurts, but it reveals. And today, if you ask me how all this has changed me, I answer without hesitation. I learned that pain doesn't need to be a secret, that silence can kill, but words can heal, and that every buried truth will one day resurface. You just have to have the courage to face it. Today, Daniel and I live in a small place, surrounded by trees, with our own backyard, our own. We planted new lavender plants, but also a magnolia, not as a reminder of pain, but as a symbol of rebuilding. Now, when I look at it, I no longer see secrets. I see choice, a choice to blossom, even after so much trauma. On weekends, we welcome my mother and father for simple lunches. The atmosphere is different, more human, quieter but less fearful. They laugh slowly, look into each other's eyes. They haven't erased the past, but they've learned not to run from it. And perhaps that's what true love means, staying, even knowing the weight of what once was. Daniel is still writing. He's now finishing his second book, this time about grief and identity. He says writing saved his life. I believe it, because I saw, with my own eyes, the broken man rise up and transform trauma into a bridge to himself and to all those who still live in silence. Sometimes we are asked, if you could go back in time, would you do things differently? And we always answer the same thing. No, because it was at rock bottom that we found our voices. It was in the place where no one else wanted to dig that we discovered who we truly were. And even though it hurt, it set us free. That box didn't just bring letters and evidence. It brought a new beginning. It tore away everything that was comfortable, but it also made room for what was real, because nothing grows in false soil. And today, everything that flourishes around us is watered by a truth that no one will hide anymore. And if this story made you reflect, touched you, provoked you, then it fulfilled its purpose. because what we found buried wasn't just Daniel's past. It was the truth of thousands. People like me, like him, like you. And if pain has roots, may it also have flowers. And may we always choose to tell what no one had the courage to say. Time has passed, but the story remains. It lives on in books, in conversations, in lectures, in the eyes of those who meet us and say, "Thank you for not keeping quiet." And every time someone says this, I feel like we've buried a new box, but this time, one of hope, of healing, of courage. Daniel learned to laugh with his whole body. That, for me, is a miracle. Before, laughter was short, tense, almost a disguise. Now, it's free, light. My father went back to sculpting. My mother went back to tending the plants. And me? I keep writing, because I know there are so many voices waiting to be freed, and each word can open a path. Sometimes I return to the old yard. I stop in front of the place where it all began. The hole is now covered with new grass, but inside me, it lives on, not as a wound, but as a memory, a reminder that even the darkest places can be replanted, and that truth is not the end. It is rebirth. Nothing we experienced was easy, but everything was real. And today, that's more valuable than any forged tranquility. Because if there's anything worth keeping, it's not silence. It's the courage to break it. And if you're listening to this, know this. Your story matters too. Even if it began in the dark, you are not alone. Your pain has a name. It has roots. And most importantly, it has a way out. It may hurt to dig, but what you find, even if it's hard, can change everything. And sometimes, all we need is that first hoe. That first impulse not to run away, to open up, to look, to tell. If this story touched you in any way, share it with someone now. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, send this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment about where you're listening from. I read every comment carefully. And remember, sometimes, what hurts you today may be exactly what sets you free tomorrow. Thank you for listening until the end.